had a Sarbanes-Oxley on top of the Sarbanes-Oxley. The Patriot Act is where we're supposed to catch terrorists. The banking industry spends $5 billion a year on the Patriot Act. You know how many terrorists have actually been caught and convicted because of the Patriot Act? None. You know what the probability of us catching a terrorist? I think it's close to zero, and if they're that dumb, I think they're going to get caught anyway. Can you imagine one of our terrorists? And by the way, if we caught a terrorist, wouldn't we call anyway? Do we need a law to tell us to call on a terrorist? You know, the only significant conviction of the terrorist under the Patriot Act is Eliot Spitzer, the governor of New York, who was convicted of soliciting prostitution. Now, in some ways, that's humorous. In some ways, it's poetic justice because Eliot Spitzer was really a bad guy. But in other ways, it should scare you. Because what is the terrorist risk of a governor of New York? And why should that be used to convict that kind of person? And what information is being gathered under the Patriot Act? I'll tell you, your privacy is being violated systematically under the Patriot Act. Another thing that happened in the industry, and this is a little esoteric, but there's a huge focus on what's called mathematical modeling, where all risks were supposed to be able to be mathematically modeled. All the mathematical models failed. The Federal Reserve's models failed, AIG's models failed, Standard & Poor's, Moody's, and Fitch's models failed. They all 100% failure rate. We were told numerous times if we just had mathematical models like Citigroup and Wachovia, we'd be in great shape from a risk management perspective from the regulators. Of course, Wachovia and Citigroup both failed in the process. Problem with mathematical models, they can be very useful tools, but they got something called a tail. And the tail, they always assume these normal distributions, and the tails are theoretically highly unlikely events. The problem is the tails are always bigger than the people that produce the models claim they are. Why is that? If you showed a big tail, nobody would pay any attention to your model, right? And so the unlikely events are more likely than you expect. Also, if something is 1% probable, give it enough time, it becomes certain. If you build your house in a 100-year floodplain, you will have a flood. That's just the way the models work. And then secondly, nobody can mathematically model human behavior under stress. So all these models collapsed. One of the biggest myths is that right now banks are being encouraged to make loans. You can go talk to any community banker in this state or any big banker in this state. That is not true. The banking regulators have dramatically tightened lending standards. And this happened in 1980. When I was in the banking business, it happened in 1990. The regulators always overreact after the fact. Why is that? There's something called public choice theory that talks about incentives. If you're a government regulator, you're a lifetime bureaucrat, you can't lose your pension, you're not at risk, the only way you can get in trouble is your bank gets in trouble. So what do you do in tough times? You tighten and you tighten because it's a self-protecting mechanism, and there are all kinds of regulations that allow you to do that. I guarantee you today, BB&T is not making loans that we should and would make, and we're putting people out of business we shouldn't be putting out of business because of the banking examiners, and that's happening across the whole country. So there is a very tough regulatory environment that has tightened bank lending standards. Let's talk a little bit about what we did economically and what we should have done. A couple things to think about. One of the most important things that we should have done is let markets correct. That is a very healthy process. When you prevent markets from correcting, you push problems into the future. And let me give you a couple examples. Keeping businesses in business that shouldn't be in business is a good thing. It's not a good thing. In my career, Citigroup has failed 3 times. Every time they've gotten bigger and worse. I'll make you a prediction. They will get bigger and they'll fail again in 15 years. There are huge incentives when you have an implicit government guarantee. General Motors Acceptance Corporation finances automobiles. They got a new name, Ally Financial. They've been bailed out by the government twice. Interestingly enough, they're one of the main culprits that created problems in the automobile business. They invented the 100% 7-year car loan. And what that meant is a lot of people after 3 years owed a lot more on their car than it was worth. And ended up defaulting on their cars. And the taxpayers have been subsidizing GMAC to keep making 7-year car loans. Now, the theory is there isn't any finance available for car buyers. That's not so. BB&T's been in the automobile finance business for 50 years. We just don't want to make 7-year, 100% car loans. We don't think that's a good economic thing to do. More interesting story is Chrysler. And some of you, maybe 1 or 2 of you in my age group, Chrysler, interesting story, failed in the early 1980s, bailed out by the government, quote, considered to be a success story, failed again, now the Italians own it. Interesting story. Interesting question. What if Chrysler had been allowed to fail in 1980? Their plants wouldn't have gone away, their workers wouldn't have gone away, their resources would have just been redistributed. Where would they have gone? Probably some of the resources would have gone to Ford and General Motors and made them more efficient operations. But even more important than that, what lessons would Ford and General Motors have learned versus the lessons they did learn? And what they learned, what particularly the unions learned, is the government's going to bail us out. If Chrysler had been allowed to fail, they'd have learned a very different lesson, and I would argue had acted very differently in the interim. In addition, a lot of Chrysler's resources may have gone to a private U.S. company in the automobile manufacturing business, and that company may have been a non-union company. People talk about the genius of the Japanese in automobile manufacturing. Their only genius is they operate non-union plants. That's where they get the huge cost advantage. A private, non-union U.S. automobile manufacturer probably would have kept the Japanese out of the U.S. market, or certainly kept them from being such dominant players in the union. We'd have a much healthier automobile business if Chrysler had been allowed to fail. Now, the big kahuna in not allowing to fail is homeowners. We have not allowed people to foreclose on houses. That's kept the housing market from bottom, and it's actually driven house prices lower than they would have been. But well, why is that? People aren't going to buy new homes because they think the prices have gotten the bottom. Who wants to buy a house and know the price is going down next week, right? They're not buying houses because they don't know we've reached the bottom. Because there's this huge inventory of foreclosed houses, which will get foreclosed, by the way. It's just a matter of when they're going to be foreclosed, hanging out there. And the inability of the real estate market to clear is a whopping drag on the economy. The second interesting error, and what we shouldn't have done, it relates to the stimulus program. Now, I think most economists, even including liberal economists, will have to objectively admit the stimulus program didn't work. They can come up with some rationalizations, but it didn't work. And it's not surprising it didn't work. Conceptually, think of this. Do you believe that spending money that you don't have to do things that don't need to be done is going to raise your standard of living? That's a pretty bizarre belief. You believe spending money you don't have to do things that don't need to be done are going to raise your standard of living. That's based on a theory by a guy named John Maynard Keynes, who is a famous economist, who wrote a book, The General Theory. You ought to read it. It's a terrible book. It's interesting. In this book, Keynes argues that under adverse circumstances, we ought to pay people to dig holes in the ground and then pay people to fill them back up. That's a pretty interesting argument, right? If you want to stimulate activity, cut taxes, but make them permanent tax cuts so people can plan ahead, and make the tax cuts available to people that create jobs. A lot of those job creators happen to be high-income people. If you want to create jobs, you've got to create incentives for the people that create jobs. Increasing regulations, and we've had a massive increase in regulations. It's the worst in my 40, not just in the banking business, but I deal with lots of other companies. We don't have rule of law in the United States. We have the rule of regulators, and they changed the law pretty radically, and we've had a real tightening of regulations in the U.S. In addition, introducing new regulation, new rules, ambiguity is very destructive. I teach leadership at Wake Forest Business School, and one thing that you teach people, in any adverse circumstance, the worst thing you can do is introduce ambiguity. Because when people are concerned and they don't know what's going on, they become more concerned. They assume the worst. So whether you think Obama's health care program or the Dodd-Frank financial bill are good bills, I don't think they are, but whether you think they are, they were terrible timing because they've created a huge amount of uncertainty. And a lot of small businesses are not hiring people right now because they can't figure out what their health care cost is going to be in the future. You know, the economic discussion is very interesting, but as interesting it is, far, far more important is the philosophical issues. And this is really not an economic crisis, it's really a philosophical crisis. The real cause of the financial crisis is a combination of altruism and pragmatism. Altruism. Where did affordable housing come from? Everybody has a right to a house provided by who? Everybody has a right to free medical care provided by who? My right to free medical care is my right to imprison a doctor to provide me that medical care, or imprison somebody else to pay that doctor to provide me with that medical care. That is exactly the opposite of the American concept of rights. In the American concept of rights, you have the right to what you produce, what you create. You don't have the right to what anybody else produces or what anybody else creates. In business, while businesses may pay lip service to altruism, you can't fundamentally be an altruist and be successful in a globally competitive market. You'll be driven out of business. So the backup philosophical position in business, and what we teach in graduate business schools, is pragmatism. And pragmatists do what works. Here's the dilemma with being a pragmatist. A lot of things work in the short term that are very destructive in the long term. Subprime mortgages work for a long time. Negative amortization mortgages work for a long time. There's also a deeper problem. If you're a pragmatist, you can't be rational, because rationality demands a long-term perspective. And if you're a pragmatist, you can't have integrity, because integrity is acting consistent with principles. And if the rule is to do what works, there are no principles to act consistent with. That's why you've seen so many integrity violations in the business community. Combination of altruism and pragmatism leads to something I call the free lunch mentality. The last presidential election, neither candidate, even this last fight we had over the debt ceiling, nobody proposed a serious solution for Social Security or Medicare. And if they had, they wouldn't have been elected, right? Unfortunately, that free lunch mentality leads to a lack of personal responsibility. And the lack of personal responsibility is the death of democracies. The Founding Fathers talked about the tyranny of the majority. And what they were talking about was the abuse of individual rights, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. But they also realized that when 51% of the people figured out they could get a free lunch from 49%, pretty soon the party's over. Because then 60% want a free lunch from 40%, and 70% want a free lunch from 30%, and finally the 30% quit. Just like the cause is philosophical, so is the cure. And the cure is the principles that have made America great in the first place. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Each individual's moral right to their own life. Each individual's moral right to the pursuit of their personal happiness. Each individual's right to the product of their labor. They produce a lot, they get a lot, including the right to give it away to whoever they want to under whatever terms they want to. If you think about that moral prerogative, it demands personal responsibility, because there is no free lunch. It also demands and rewards rationality. It demands and rewards self-discipline. Most people, when they hear life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, think of liberty, and liberty is very important, but that's an old idea. The world-changing idea was the pursuit of happiness. Before Jefferson, before the thinkers of the Enlightenment, everybody existed for somebody else's good. Good of the king, good of the state, good of the church. Nobody existed for their own good. What Jefferson said is each one of us has the moral right to our own life. We're not guaranteed success in that pursuit of happiness, but we have that right. And that idea changed the world, created the most successful and the most benevolent society in history. Because when people have the right to their own life, they're naturally nicer to other people. In socialist and communist societies, everybody ends up hating each other because they're all slaves to each other. The United States was actually the first country created on the idea that people should act in their rational self-interest, properly understood. Not taking advantage of other people, but not self-sacrificing. Becoming traders, creating value for value. In our business, we help our clients be successful, and they let us make a profit doing it. Life is about creating win-win relationships. My favorite book by far is Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. I hope many of you have read it. If you hadn't read it, you ought to read it. It is very relevant to today. It's eerie. She wrote the book in 1957. One of the reasons she wrote the book was to make her predictions not come true. Eerily, her predictions are coming true. The bad guys are right in the book. And it's scary, and it's scary where we go from here if the rest of her predictions come true. So you really ought to read Atlas Shrugged and think about it. Where do we go from an economic perspective? We are really struggling. We've had a very since the Depression, we've never had a recovery this weak, and you can even argue whether we've had any recovery at all if you look through some of the numbers. I personally don't think we're in for a second dip unless Europe collapses, and they're 20 years ahead of us, which is an interesting lesson economically. I think we're more likely to have over the next 5-10 years something called stagflation. And stagflation looks like low real growth, higher inflation, particularly in commodity prices, higher unemployment than we ought to have, maybe a little bit lower than now. Not good times by any means, but not horrible times, but not good and healthy times. What really scares me is long term. And everybody in this room ought to really be worried about the long term. If we continue with our altruism, pragmatism, free lunch mentality, the United States has in place, mathematically certain, an economic disaster. If you look at the unfunded liabilities under Social Security, under Medicare, under the new Obama health care program, under unfunded public pension plans, they're in excess of $100 trillion. It is a stunning number. We're running $1.3 trillion annual operating deficits right now. We have a dysfunctional foreign policy. We have a big problem with retirement of the baby boomer generation. A lot of us old people are going to want to keep being fed. If you look at Japan, people have wondered about the Japanese economic problems. It's all explained by demographics. They got too many old people, and we're facing the same kind. And we got a failed K-12 education system. I mentioned the story that I was on a committee of the Financial Service Roundtable. We were running the numbers for Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, and it was mathematically certain they were going broke. You could argue about which year, but it was. Run the numbers in the United States. It is mathematically certain that we go broke. You can argue whether it's 15 years or 25 years, but it was within that range if we don't change direction. We're going to get. Now, countries don't file bankruptcy typically. What countries usually do is they hyperinflate. They print a bunch of money that becomes low in value, and they usually move towards status economies. The worse things get, the more government gets involved and makes things worse. It's kind of a cycle down. Exactly what's happened in this phenomenon. More government interference in the markets, more cycle down. Argentina, 1940, had a higher standard of living than the United States. They moved towards statism, and now they're a third world country. And we're the next Argentina if we don't change direction. Now, here's the good news. We can change direction. It is not too late. We do have to change direction relatively soon. We have to do something in the next 5 years, or some of these things start, if anybody's ever fooled with compounding effects, they just start moving out of control. But we can do something. Here's the dilemma. We can't do something without pain. I use the analogy, we've been identified as having a form of terminal cancer, that if it's not treated, we will die. The good news is treatable. The bad news is we have to have chemotherapy. It's not treatable without any pain. And the question is really, do we have the courage to deal with the pain to cure our problems? And that is really the fundamental issue. But we have terminal cancer from an economic perspective if we're unwilling to deal with our problems. And I particularly like to talk to young people because we're really setting you up for really bad times. You won't starve to death, I don't think, but really bad times unless we deal with these economic problems. Now, I happen to be in the optimistic group. I know a lot of people that agree with me in a lot of issues are pessimistic. And the reason I'm optimistic is what I call the American sense of life. I think at some gut level, and I think the Tea Party is a mixed, there are great things about it, not so good things about it, but I think the Tea Party is symbolic of the American sense of life. And the American sense of life is we are independent, entrepreneurial people. We're very productive people as a group, as a nation. We can fix this problem. And I think that American sense of life has protected us. We've never gone this close, but we've had bad, the 70s were really bad, and we turned it around. And we bought some time. So it's not an unfixable problem. And what makes me encouraged is the American sense of life. But the sense of life is a very intangible thing, and we need to provide the intellectual ammunition so people can execute on that. And that's what I kind of want to give a few minutes of closing thoughts on this. And one reason I try to talk to groups like this is people in here, the students and other people, are leaders. And you have an impact on other people whether you read it or not, recognize it or not. And we all have to lead ourselves. And if you look at the problems we've fundamentally had ethical problems at the individualistic level. We've had failures of leadership in business. We've had failures of leadership in government. We have individuals that have acted in a very unethical fashion. And we need to re-energize that kind of ethical commitment. And I think there are three great virtues. And these are the three great virtues we used at BB&T that I believe in. The three great virtues: purpose, reason, and self-esteem. Purpose, reason, and self-esteem. As human beings, we're purpose-directed entities. We have to know where we're going in order to get there. Organizations, business, churches, civic organizations, universities are simply groups of human beings. For organizations to be successful, the people in those organizations must vest in the purpose of the organization. At the individual level, one thing that really disturbs me is how many people I encounter when I ask them about their work, just describe their work as some kind of burden. I've got to go to work. And I think about all the time, effort, and energy people spend at work. And if your work is just burden, wow, are you missing a lot of what life is about? And by the way, this is it. This is not practice. This is it. If you want to have passion and energy in your life, you have to have a sense of purpose in your work, whatever you define your work to be. And I would argue that purpose, while the content will vary a lot, is the context is the same for everybody in this room. And I believe the context has two components. First, I believe that everybody in this room wants to make the world a better place to live. I don't think you'd be here today if you didn't want to make the world a better place to live. I think that's a characteristic of the vast majority of human beings. Not everybody, but the vast majority of human beings. Interesting thing is there are lots of ways to make the world a better place to live. You don't have to go to Africa and feed hungry children to make the world a better place to live. Businesses make the world a better place to live. We provide better products, better services that improve the quality of life. In fact, the primary difference between the quality of life in the United States and the quality of life in Africa is we have better businesses. Business is noble work. You have to produce something before it can be given away. It's the act of production is the ultimate noble act. When business leaders forget they're in business to make the world a better place to live, bad things happen to their businesses. Good attorneys, good doctors, good teachers, good homemakers make the world a better place to live. There are lots of ways to make the world a better place to live, but you need to believe that your work is making the world a better place to live. The second component of purpose is equally important and way under discussed, and we do our children a real disservice on this. You need to make the world a better place to live doing something you want to do for you. You have a fundamental right to your own life. If you were to make the world a better place to live, but you didn't enjoy doing it, you will have wasted the most precious thing you have, which is you. And by the way, if you try to make the world a better place to live doing something you don't want to do, the odds are you won't do it very well. So you need to make the world a better place to live, but doing something you want to do for you. The means by which we accomplish our purpose is our capacity to think. We use the term reason. Everything that's alive has a method of staying alive. A lion has claws to hunt with, a deer has speed to avoid the hunter. We have the capacity to think. And our capacity to think is literally our only means of survival, success, and happiness. And no shortcuts, no free lunches. Sorry, that's just the way it is. I talked to the employees about BB&T about thinking and noted that I don't know what role IQ plays in the thinking process. I know this, there are a lot of very bright people that do very destructive things, so IQ by itself is not the definer of a thoughtful person. And also I don't know how much you can impact your IQ, but you can make a choice. You can choose to be a disciplined thinker, to commit yourself to be a lifelong learner, and in that context, commit yourself to have a very active mind. And people that are lifelong learners that are committed to having active minds have the capacity to become masters of their field of endeavor. They have the capacity to become really good at what they do. And that's what we need in a global economy. We need people that are really good at whatever it is they do. And people that have that commitment to lifelong learning, they read more, they take advantage of educational seminars, but they're particularly effective at learning from life experiences. We are primarily experiential learners. We primarily learn from our life experiences. We don't primarily learn in school. We learn a lot in school, but we primarily learn from our life experiences. And if you look at people that are superior experiential learners, they do two simple but profound things well. Probably everybody in here can associate with learning from your mistakes. You probably made mistakes that changed your life, right? On the other hand, a lot of times we don't learn from our mistakes, right? We get to do them over and over again. Probably everybody in here can think of a personality characteristic where you've done something, you say, ooh, I did that before, I did that before. We don't always learn from our mistakes. Why don't we learn from our mistakes? In order to learn from a mistake, we have to have the courage to admit the deepest psychological cause of the mistake. Not that we made a mistake, but the real cause of that mistake. And unfortunately, a lot of times we evade. And evasion is the ultimate psychological sin. Evasion occurs when you're presented with some piece of information that at some level you know needs to be examined. But you refuse to examine it because it threatens something you want to believe about the world, or most importantly, it threatens something you want to believe about yourself, so you literally don't hear it. And when you evade, you're detached from reality and bad things happen. I started out my career as a small business, mostly a small farm lender. Simple observation, number one reason small businesses fail, the leader of that business evades. Things are going along fine in the economy, then something happens. Something happens at home, something happens in their business. They don't want to hear about it, they run the business right into the ground. More interesting, more dramatic story. Largest financial institution in the world, Citigroup, hires a group of geniuses out of Harvard, PhDs, out of MIT, to run their affordable housing, now subprime lending business. May even have been a legitimate business when they started. I guarantee you, long before any of us heard about the disastrous effect of subprime lending, those geniuses in the back room of Citigroup knew something was going along. But what did they do? They evaded. Why did they evade? They were going to make less money, their company was going to make less money, and they drove Citigroup right into the ground. In fact, I would argue most of the really bad mistakes I've seen made in business were made by highly intelligent, well-educated people that evaded. They didn't want to face the facts. The second thing that superior experiential learners know is that life is a constant education if you choose to make it one. BB&T operated with a series of 33 community banks, and I would go visit those banks and have lunches with our local advisory board members who are business and community leaders. I never had a boring lunch. They were always asking me questions. They were always interested. They were always paying attention to what was going on, and you could see why they were successful, because they were in focus. Unfortunately, a lot of people live their lives out of focus, and if you're out of focus, you can't learn, you can't grow. IQ may be important in many cases, but my observation for success and happiness in life is not that correlated with IQ. But I find in terms of success, people that evade less and stay in focus more are much more likely to be successful, because most people evade a lot and don't stay in focus. Interesting thing that happens when you're clear about your purpose, you use your thinking capacity to accomplish your purpose, you get to do something very important. You get to raise your self-esteem. Observation. At higher levels in organizations, for people that go to the Harvard Law School, when people fail later in their careers, it's almost never because they aren't smart enough, they aren't well educated enough. If they fail, it's usually because they have some subconscious low self-esteem issue that results in self-destructive behavior. And unfortunately, you see that fairly often, not all the time, but fairly often. In addition, self-esteem is the foundation for happiness, and happiness is the end of the game, right? When I say happiness, I don't mean having a good time on Friday night, but I mean a life well lived. Happiness in the Aristotelian sense of that, the word. Hard earned, hard work. When you're 80 years old and say, it was tough and I'm glad I did it. That kind of happiness. That's the end of the game, right? Sometimes people in business get confused. They think money's the end of the game. Nothing wrong with money. Money's a good thing. But money is not an end. It can be a means to an end. It is not an end. Happiness is the end of the game. And self-esteem is the foundation for happiness. Self-esteem is a complex subject. I want to share a couple thoughts about it. First, self-esteem is fundamentally self-confidence in your ability to live and be successful given the facts of reality. Therefore, you earn self-esteem by how you live your life. Nobody can give you self-esteem. You cannot give anybody self-esteem. You cannot give your children self-esteem. Self-esteem has to be earned. Live your life with integrity. Raise your self-esteem. Second thought about self-esteem. For everybody in this room and for the vast majority of people on this planet, most of your self-esteem will come from your work. And I use work in the broadest context, raising children, very productive, very hard work. However you define your work, most of your self-esteem is going to come from your work because you're going to spend a disproportionate amount of time, effort, and energy at work. That's what makes work important. Something I say to all the employees of BB&T. You know, it's real important to BB&T that you do your job well. It's far, far, far more important to you. Might fool me about how well you do your job. Might fool your boss about how well you do your job. Well, you'll never fool you. You'll always know. And if you don't do your work the best you can possibly do it, given your level of skill, given your level of knowledge, you can't do the impossible. But if you don't do your work the best you can possibly do it, you will lower your self-esteem. Good news, the flip's also true. Do your work the best you can possibly do it, given your level of skill, level of knowledge, level of skill, and you will raise your self-esteem. And that's more important than when you get more money or you get a promotion, because it's about who you are as a human being. And interestingly enough, that concept has huge social implications. Take an entry-level construction worker, a bricklayer. Has a tough, hard life. Reminds me of my granddad. Tough, hard life. But he gets through it. He and his wife raise their children. They have a successful life, although it's a hard-earned, kind of tough, kind of successful life. Interesting thing about that bricklayer, he gets something very precious from that hard work. He gets to be proud of himself. He gets to have self-esteem. Take that same bricklayer and give him welfare. He may be better off materially, but he gives up something incredibly important. He gives up his pride. He gives up his self-esteem. You know, there's a lot of focus now, and a lot of people in the political arena are focused on security. And security matters to us, but the United States is not the land of security. People didn't get on a boat and come to Jamestown to be secure. The United States is the land of opportunity. Opportunity to be great, the opportunity to fail and try again, but most importantly, the opportunity of that bricklayer to live his life on his own terms, to pursue his personal happiness based on his own beliefs. And that is the American sense of life, and that is what's so precious to protect. Thank you very much.